During the Cruz interview at the Conway Sun this morning, I got only one question. So I asked him if he knew the Mahdi was, the 12th Imam, and what the significance of belief in the Mahdi had for American relations with Iran. And Cruz took that question and he knocked it out of the park. I didn't have to ask any more. A discussion ensued, and I just sat back and listened, and you can do that too. I've asked this question to many candidates, especially 8 years ago, when President Ahmadinejad came to the UN every September while I was teaching it, and he would invoke the Mahdi, the 12th Imam. You know who that is?
I did.
And what the significance is to Iranian Shia?
Well, it's an important question because it helps understand the views of the Ayatollah Khamenei. It is the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, comes in an apocalyptic final battle where they believe it will usher in the victory of Islam worldwide. And it's one of the reasons why a nuclear Iran is, I believe, the greatest national security threat facing the country. And, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a moment that really drew into sharp relief the magnitude of the threat, which was North Korea allegedly testing a hydrogen bomb. We don't have that confirmed, but they claim they were testing a hydrogen bomb, and it appears to be clearly a nuclear test they were doing. If you look at North Korea and go back to the 1990s where the Clinton administration relaxed sanctions against North Korea, led the entire world in relaxing sanctions, billions of dollars flowed into North Korea in exchange for a promise not to develop nuclear weapons. They turned around, took those billions of dollars, and developed nuclear weapons. The lead negotiator for that North Korea deal under the Clinton administration was a woman named Wendy Sherman. When President Obama was elected, Obama and Hillary Clinton recruited Wendy Sherman to come back to be the lead negotiator in Iran. She was literally the only person on the planet who had screwed this up once.
Got a second shot.
And she got a second shot, and she made the exact same mistake. She negotiated effectively the same deal, except in this case it's $150 billion going to Iran for the same empty promises which nobody believes. But your question highlights why Iran is qualitatively more dangerous, which is Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un were and are both radical, unpredictable, extreme, but both father and son are basically megalomaniacal narcissists, which means hopefully some degree of rational deterrence is possible, because they both understand if they ever use a nuclear weapon, their regime will be over. The danger with Khamenei, and this goes to the apocalyptic theocratic view of Khamenei and the mullahs, is that they glorify death and suicide. They welcome the apocalypse to bring the coming of the Mahdi. And in my view, the North Korean nuclear test is essentially a crystal ball foreshadowing where this country goes if Hillary is elected. That in 3, 4, 5 years, Iran, just like North Korea, will be testing a nuclear weapon, but given the apocalyptic views, the religious death cult of the leadership, I think the odds are unacceptably high that instead of testing the weapon underground, they'll test it in the skies of Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles.
What about obviously you're against the agreement, but what about the agreement? The Iranians, they basically, if you believe, the Atomic Energy Agency, International Atomic Energy Agency, 6 countries, Russia, China, France, Germany, Britain, and us, that we've gutted the program. You don't believe it?
I do not believe it at all. The agreement was designed to be flouted, and I would note many of our allies, when this agreement was being negotiated, ambassadors for our allies would come by my office complaining about the enormous strong-arming and pressure that was coming from the Obama administration to get on board. This was the Obama administration that drove our allies, did real damage by unraveling the international consensus on sanctions. But this agreement was designed on its face to facilitate Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. Why do I say that? Number one, we were initially promised anytime, anywhere inspections. That promise got quickly discarded. Under the terms of the agreements, the Iranians get effectively 24 days' notice before any inspection. Now, if you're designing an inspection regime, I've used the analogy before. Imagine if the state of New Hampshire passed a law that said before you could execute any search warrant on a drug lord, you have to give them 24 days notice about the place to be searched. Now that's an inspection regime that is guaranteed to ensure you'll never find anything. Even the dumbest drug lord on earth, with 24 days notice, would avoid anything being discovered. But even worse, under the terms of the agreement, there's some locations that are completely off limits from inspections. And there are other locations that the Iranians are trusted to inspect themselves. Anyone looking at this agreement knows to a metaphysical certainty Iran will use this agreement to acquire nuclear weapons. I would note, while this agreement is being negotiated, the State Department is sitting down with the Iranians. A senior Iranian general tweets, the annihilation of Israel is non-negotiable.
Nobody's disagreeing that there's radical elements in Iran.
No, but it's not radical elements, it's the leadership. It's not elements. This is not a democratic world where you're worried, does this faction? This is an absolute dictatorship. The Ayatollah Khamenei, what he wants, he is the supreme leader. So it's not elements, it is the Iranian revolution that has seized. This is a theocratic, homicidal, in the middle of this agreement. While it was being negotiated, the Iranian Navy set up a mock U.S. naval ship, did war exercises bombing it. That didn't cause the Obama administration to stop. In the middle of negotiating this agreement, the Ayatollah Khamenei, to the assembled masses, joined them in burning American flags and Israeli flags and chanting death to America. Literally, we're negotiating with someone who's chanting death to America and burning our flag. And go back last week. Last week, Iran seizes 2 Navy ships, does everything they can to humiliate 10 sailors, to drop them to their knees, to humiliate them. And the Obama administration not only thanks them, heaps praise upon them, and then is now releasing billions of dollars. And Iran today is the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. This week we saw something that has never occurred before in the history of the country, which is the Obama administration has become the world's leading financier of radical Islamic terrorism. We know to an absolute certainty Khamenei is going to take those billions and give money to Hamas, to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to radical Islamic terrorists, and they will use that money to murder Americans.
What's the alternative? We've had sanctions in place in Iran, and they've shown that they're willing to let their people starve before, they would give up. So right now, I understand, they have given up many of their centrifuges, and they're like 2 years from being able to build a nuclear device, as opposed to 3 months.
So the alternative is to use every tool we have to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Sanctions actually were having a significant effect. Their economy was in free fall. They were crippled, and I would note that if you go just a few years earlier, Libya, we had sanctions against both Iran and Libya. The sanctions against Libya were crippling, and they caused Gaddafi to shut down his nuclear program. The sanctions had proven effective. He handed over not only that, Gaddafi had begun cooperating with America in tracking down radical Islamic terrorists. The sanctions had worked very well in Libya until President Obama and Hillary Clinton led NATO in toppling Gaddafi, and they handed that country over to radical Islamic terrorists. I mean, it's one of the greatest foreign policy blunders of modern times. With respect to Iran, what should we be doing? 3 years ago, I filed legislation that laid out what I think was a rational plan with Iran. I believe in peace through strength. I think when it comes to homicidal dictators, appeasement, history has proven, is a badly flawed strategy. So the legislation I filed would have immediately reimposed sanctions, would have strengthened them to make them even more crippling, would have hit the key juncture points on energy and oil and the automotive industry and cutting off their financing even more aggressively, and then would have laid out a very clear path for Iran to lift the sanctions. If Iran wants to lift the sanctions, they can disassemble all 19,000 centrifuges. They can hand over all of their enriched uranium. They can shut down their ICBM program, which, by the way, the only purpose of the ICBM program is to carry a nuclear warhead to the United States of America. You don't need an ICBM to get to Israel. An ICBM is only to cross the Atlantic and murder Americans. In the middle of negotiating this agreement, they tested 2 intermediate-range missiles in violations of sanctions. The Obama administration ignored that. And finally ceased being the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. That actually would be a sensible approach to a zealot who has said over and over again he wants to murder as many Americans as he can.
But what we have is pretty close. 90% of the
We do
uranium
not.
is gone. The centrifuges, except for whatever percentages.
With $150 billion, they will accelerate their nuclear program. They will do it in secret.
And you don't believe the inspectors are worth anything.
Did it work in North Korea? There's the identical promises there. We gave them, they had less money there. This will not work, and everyone knows it won't work. Prime Minister Netanyahu quite rightly said the only person telling the truth about this is President Rouhani, who says we got everything we want. America gave us everything. He's telling the truth. And there's the old aphorism: those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We are we've signed the exact same agreement with Iran as we did with North Korea, and the outcome is going to be the exact same, except with Iran, the risks are far higher that the Ayatollah Khamenei is willing to risk. Take, for example, a nuclear weapon detonated over Tel Aviv. It would murder vast numbers of Palestinians. No rational person would do that. The problem is, Khamenei is not a rational person. When you have a religious zealot who glorifies in death and suicide, I think the odds are unacceptably high that he would be willing to sacrifice those Palestinians in order to have the opportunity to murder Jews. The so-called father of the Iranian nuclear program, an Iranian scientist, who has since died, was actually murdered by the Mossad, allegedly. That's what the widespread assumption is. His last will and testament specified that on his tombstone he wanted written, "Here lies a man who sought to annihilate Israel." I mean, that's a level of religious hatred that it is difficult for rational people to understand. That someone writes in their will, that's what I want my tombstone to say, that my abiding fury and focus in life was to annihilate Israel. And this was the father of the Iranian nuclear program. And in my view, President Obama is reliving Munich in 1938. And just like Chamberlain, he is coming back saying we have peace in our time. And history has shown when you have a homicidal leader and you aid and abet his acquiring the tools and weaponry to commit mass murder, that the results have been cataclysmic.
So if you're president, you get in, you rip up the agreement, what about the other countries?
So I've pledged on day one, if I'm elected, I'll rip the agreement to shreds. And because President Obama has neither submitted it as a treaty to the Senate for ratification nor submitted it to Congress as a statute, it is purely an executive agreement, and any executive has full authority to abrogate it. The other nations, I will work to get to reimpose sanctions. Whether they do or not, it would be far better if they did. And it's one of the lasting damages that the Obama-Clinton foreign policy has caused, is unraveling that consensus. But when these sanctions started, they were unilateral American sanctions. And the American control and influence in the world economy is such that unilateral American sanctions are nonetheless crushing. They're not as effective as the whole world, but they are seriously punitive. And the odds are not insignificant that the next president, when he or she is sworn in, will be told you have two and only two choices. Either acquiesce in Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, or use direct military force to stop it. I hope that's not the case. It depends how quickly Iran proceeds towards acquiring nuclear weapons technology, and this agreement will facilitate it. If that is the choice, we need a president who will not acquiesce in Iran's acquiring nuclear weapons. And by the way, if you think about the options, if you're game playing, what happens? Nobody knows for sure what the chances are that Khamenei would use nuclear weapons. I think they're unacceptably high, whatever the chances are. But the alternative, let's assume he doesn't use nuclear weapons. He acquires nuclear weapons but doesn't use them. The alternative is Iran becomes an even greater regional hegemon. That Iran devotes even more resources to funding Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, radical Islamic terrorists. That Iran expands its influence trying to take over governments across the region, and they murder more and more Americans, Israelis, and Europeans. And that, by the way, is the thank God scenario, where you're thrilled they didn't use the nuclear weapons. That's the best case outcome. And I've joked that in many ways, Barack Obama has managed to do the impossible, which he has unified Israel and the Arabs. That they're both standing together going, allowing Iran to get nukes is nuts. I mean, the degree of agreement right now between Israel and the Saudis and the Egypts and the Emiratis and everyone surrounding Iran, that Iran's getting nuclear weapons, is an absolute catastrophe. Demonstrates the absolute naivete of this administration.